This video is sponsored by Factor, the best meal delivery service there is. These are the healthiest meals, and for those like me who really can't cook for themselves that well, they cook it for you and they send it your way, prepared, and all you have to do is just warm it up. And honestly, I could say it has changed my life completely, where they made eating healthy such a non-issue. Once Factor came into my life, it's not even a thought anymore. The only thing I have to do is picking what meal I want, and Factor has some of the best chefs there is to make any kind of dish and send it my way. You can go vegan, keto, calorie smart. It depends on what kind of meal that you want, what is the purpose of it, and they got it right for you, and you don't have to think about what they're giving you. It's always really good stuff. They have a full menu on their website. Definitely go to check those out. And they got everything you need. No more grocery trips, no more cooking. Everything is right there for you. All you have to do is just warm it up. It gives you simple directions how to do it, and you could just enjoy the best meal that you can get. Especially for those who have allergies, for an example, if you're lactose intolerant or you can have some kind of animal products or whatever it is, they have you covered there. I'm someone who suffers from these sort of things. For an example, I have to go on low FODMAP diets. No matter what it is, Factor has the best meals for your diet. Just click the link in the description below, or just head to go.factor75.com/TheWeasle130 and use the promo code TheWeasle130 to get $130 off across 6 boxes. Make sure to head to Factor, man. I cannot recommend them enough for you guys. It's a great deal and it can absolutely change your life. What's up, guys? Merry Christmas, happy holidays. I hope it was great for you guys. I just spent time with the family, just relaxed and stuff. And it was nice, man. And it started snowing. The only time I ever like snow is only on Christmas. And the year is finally over. No fights for a month. And at least there's a lot of time to recap the year and all of that. So I'm going to be running polls for you guys to dictate who the fighter of the year and all of that is. And then I'll make a video of the results of those and also maybe give my own pick of who I think the fighter of the year, the finish of the year, all of that is. So it's going to be really fun. And I'm also thinking about other videos coming out, like my predictions for the champions of 2023. Prospects of the year is going to be coming up as well. Scouting out like talent outside the UFC and who I think is going to make it somewhere. I'm usually pretty good on those. I'm usually pretty accurate on who gets into the UFC and who does pretty well. So there are some really talented fighters right now, young guys coming up outside of the organization, and I can't wait to show you guys. But not too much has been going on in MMA. The whole Whittaker and Costa thing is pretty strange. So apparently Paulo Costa never signed to fight Robert Whittaker, and they kind of jumped ahead of themselves on announcing that fight for Perth. But Costa never signing it and saying that he's not going to fight Whittaker due to a lack of pay that he thinks he deserves. And he absolutely does. I hope Paulo Costa makes as much money as possible, but he's making $70 and $70. $70,000 to show and $70,000 to win for a former title challenger and a guy who's been consistently like in the top 10 almost his entire UFC career. It is strange to see him get paid so little in comparison to some other fighters. But who do we blame for that? I can see where some people are trying to say that it's the organization and stuff, but the organization is going to try to negotiate this with you. And if you take up a deal that isn't necessarily too great, that's kind of on you, So I also see how people are saying that it's Paulo Costa's fault for accepting the deal and being sour about it later. At the end of the day, I hope he gets paid, man. I want to see him fight again. He's very entertaining for us fans, and this kind of stuff is never good for the fans because we don't get to see the guy fight. He's not getting the money that we wish he gets. I do have to point out, though, it's very strange. I don't think there's any ranked fighter in the UFC that doesn't have a win over a current UFC fighter. Yeah, all of Paulo Costa's wins are against guys who are not in the UFC anymore. Luke Rockhold retired. Yoel Romero in Bellator. Uriah Hall retired. Johnny Hendricks retired. Oluwale Bangbolshe released. Gareth McClellan not fighting in the UFC anymore. Interesting stat, and it may be a big negotiation tactic that the organization is holding against Paulo Costa for getting more money. They can easily just tell him, hey man, you have no wins against anybody in the UFC, let alone a ranked fighter. So it's a tough position for Paulo Costa, but man, I hope it all works out for him. And the other big thing is Robert Whittaker is pulled off the Perth card. I hope they're able to keep him on there because Jared Cannonier just said in the MMA Hour that he is willing to take that rematch. So 2 months from now, Cannonier is ready to fight Paulo Costa in Australia. I don't think Whittaker will want to get off the card. I don't think he wants to just stop his training camp and everything. I mean, the effort is not for nothing, because it does make him a better fighter, but he's preparing for a fight. He's spending money for a fight, and I think he wants to get paid at least. And going up against a guy he already beat pretty soundly, to be honest, I think it's a good thing for him to take, at least a good option, because there really isn't no good option. Other than that, who can Whittaker fight? Pereira's going to be fighting Adesanya most likely. Vittori's not available. Brunson's not available. Costa's not going to fight him. Strickland just lost. I think he would rather fight Cannonier than Strickland. Dolidze is booked. Hermanson just lost, and he's way down in the rankings. rather fight Cannonier. He could try his hand at light heavyweight, but he did mention that he wants some more time to jump up to 205, so he could fight like an Anthony Smith or something. It would put Whittaker to such a big disadvantage. I think Cannonier is the only opponent that makes any sort of logical sense with not putting him at a disadvantage. It's not the greatest fight in the world, but it is a bit interesting, especially with that power from Cannonier, always able to change a fight. And he did hurt Whittaker in that third round, if you remember. So I hope they're able to make that fight. I want to see Whittaker on the card, and at least we get something out of this, you know? Also, not great news is the whole thing around Bryce Mitchell. I feel for the guy. He's contemplating retirement after that Topuria loss. It's hit him so hard that he's actually thinking about never stepping foot in the cage again. That's wild, man. I didn't think him of all people would do that after a loss, because they even asked him in the press conference for someone who's never lost before, and he said he's lost many times, right? He lost against his neighbor, he said. So it's not unfamiliar for him, but the moment he loses in the octagon, he got finished, it destroyed him. Topuria is just that guy. He crushed Bryce Mitchell mentally like that. That's insane. I hope Mitchell doesn't retire. I think it's just a phase right now, but you never know for sure. I think he's going to bounce back after this. I think he's going to get into the groove of things. And more than anything else, I hope he gets better after this. Right? I hope he's able to see the good things out of it, like a learning experience, and become a better fighter, instead of just dwelling on the loss and not learning from it at all, because he was making excuses saying that he was sick and everything, and that's not a good sign moving forward. We need guys like Bryce Mitchell in the featherweight division, and also guys we need in the featherweight division that might be making their return. We don't know yet, but there are hints. Zabit Magomedsharipov. So a lot of people speculated that he would come back. It's not confirmed yet, but he is hinting at a return. And even his brother said in the comments of his Instagram post, let me just pull it up for his exact words. Okay, so Zabit says, contracts are no longer the same, of course. And he has a smiling emoji, kind of. And then his brother goes and says, everything will change with you coming back soon. I hope he comes back, man. We need him. The featherweight division needs him so bad right now. He looked to be, even still today, one of the most skilled featherweights we've ever seen. He is so technical everywhere, and we need someone like him to at least go up against Volkanovski so we can witness it, so we can see the most well-rounded fighter in the featherweight division and how he could perform up against the dominant champion, the pound-for-pound #1. And also remember, he got the surgery, so his gas tank could be better. That is still a question that has yet to be answered, and I hope the guy comes back. And not up against a top contender. I think he needs a tune-up fight before that, because he hasn't fought for 3 years, ever since his fight with Kelvin Kattar. He's definitely going to need a tune-up fight if he comes back, and stemming off of his performance, whether he needs another fight or he gets an immediate title shot. But he's going to have to go back into the USADA pool, so there's a bit of time there. We have the interim championship going on between Yair and Emmett. The winner of that's going to fight Volkanovski, and hopefully by then, let's say the end of 2023, we see Zabit return, and he's in the octagon. Well, yeah, man, I don't know what I'm going to be watching for the next month. I don't know if there's any boxing fights. I might have to revisit that. The next ONE Championship fight is happening on January 13th, so nothing there. The next KSW fight is in 30 days. But other than that, I do want to talk about the Blachowicz and Magomed scoring a little bit more and clarify some things on that breakdown, and really showing even more flaws of the scoring system than we originally thought. A lot of arguments got risen, and there were really good arguments some of you guys were putting out. The only thing is, with the rules that were given, you can only make so much sense for it to actually matter according to the judging criteria, which is completely flawed, right? I saw a lot of you guys' arguments. You know, you were saying that the kicks in the first round had to have been damaging, at least medium, because you saw the effect of them in the second and third rounds, right? So they had to have been more impactful than they looked. And this makes sense. This is logical, right? Here's the issue. It's based off speculation and not exactly what you're seeing. It's like looking for an answer as to what caused the damage in the second or third round, so you start to look at the first. And someone can easily make a counter argument against you by saying that none of the kicks in the first round were damaging. All the damage happened in the second and third. 5% of the damage were in the first round, but the 95% were in the second and third rounds. And how could you disprove that, right? I have evidence. Look at the reaction from the kicks. Those kicks had more impact, right? And in the first round, most of the kicks were not landing to the shin. They were not landing where Magomed was getting hurt in the second and third rounds. So I saw a lot of that argument, but that's where I kind of see it falling flat. It's based off speculation and not exactly evidence, right? There was like 2 kicks in the first round that showed you the kind of impact that you're looking for, right? But the majority of them were not. And remember, not all leg kicks are the same, and even not all calf kicks are the same. Some of them do more damage than others. You could absolutely have where light leg kicks start to accumulate and add on to that damage in the next rounds. That's the main reason why I scored most of them as light and a couple of them arguable or medium. And then I would say in the second and third rounds, those are more medium and heavy. You see what I'm saying? Because I'm purely going off the reaction from the kicks. And remember, the judging criteria defines what impact is. If the kick by itself, like one individual kick, if it does not have an effect on the opponent, it's not going to be scored as something that's impactful. This is defined in the rules. This is not something I'm making up. This is not something that I created to follow. I'm strictly going off what the rules state, even as much as I disagree with it. If I were to make my own rules, if I were able to make my own judging criteria, I would abolish most of this stuff. I don't like most of this stuff. This whole cumulative damage, I would completely change that. Even the immediate damage, I would change some stuff about that too. And many other things about the judging criteria, but this is what we have and this is what we have to follow, as flawed as it is. I wanted to talk about the methods I went through in order to judge that fight, because some of your guys' arguments are exactly how I was scoring the fight originally. So I actually had to redo the breakdown. I did it once. I had to redo the whole thing because I ran into an issue, and that was scoring some of those leg kicks in the first round. Originally, I was scoring them all medium and even one of them heavy. And the reason why I was doing that was because I was thinking about the second and third rounds. I was thinking about, okay, these leg kicks have to be bigger because Magomed got hurt in the second and third rounds from the leg kicks. But then when I got down to the individual kicks, the issue I ran into was, how much damage did this kick cause? How much damage did that kick cause? We start to look at what contributed to the cumulative damage. And instead of looking at the individual kick by itself and the reaction that Magomed gave from that kick, we're speculating that this one did a lot of damage, that one did a lot of damage. It's entirely based off speculation rather than looking at the actual reaction from the kicks. Because not every kick is the same. Not every calf kick is the same. And not all of them landed in the same spot. In fact, Jan was hurting Magomed's leg with inside shin kicks, not necessarily to the thigh. And most of the leg kicks in the first round were to the thigh. Actually, the only times he ever hit the inside of the shin were the only times you ever saw Magomed gave any kind of reaction to the kicks. Magomed didn't give much of a reaction to this single kick alone. So how could I really score a medium? How could I really score a heavy? Whenever he got hit to the thigh, he just walked it off like it was nothing. And that was the issue I was running into as well. I was trying to look for an answer as to what caused the cumulative damage in the second and third rounds. And I started to reward every single kick as if it was damaging. But when you look at the individual kicks, it starts to look kind of silly, you know? You start to reward more damage to kicks when they don't look like they are, the reactions aren't the same. And so I started to focus on individual kicks by themselves. There were like 2 kicks in the round, 2 or 3 kicks that even phased Magomed at all. At least from like the initial reaction that you can visibly see. So I went back to the judging criteria, I read it again, and I looked under cumulative damage because this is what it is, right? It only states about each round. So the issue about this fight specifically was the cumulative damage was only showing round after round. It wasn't showing inside of one single round, for example, the first. The damage was really showing its effect in the second and third rounds, not in the first. So I took it as cumulative damage only really matters if it happens inside of a single round, not what happens in later rounds. Because the way you have to score fights is like each round, it's its own fight. That's essentially what the rules are stating. And looking at some of those leg kicks from Jan Blachowicz, it was very strange for me to score them so highly, and they weren't really showing much effect on Magomed. Only like 2 or 3 of them did. So I went back after reading the rules again and clearing some things up, and that's why I had to lower the damage on each kick, because I can't look at the second or third rounds. You get into a murky territory where you're looking at an individual kick and you're thinking, did this one cause more damage? At that point, you're speculating. And that's why I didn't want to go to. I didn't want to get into this whole speculation thing. I decided to go to what showed as a reaction. Where did Magomed react? Now, even scoring the way I did, you could still give the first round to Jan Blachowicz. The best argument against the way I scored it was lowering the damage that Magomed actually inflicted. Because yes, the push kicks were not as damaging as some of those leg kicks. So you could definitely score the first round to Jan Blachowicz and overall making the fight a draw. Again, I didn't say that the fight couldn't be a draw or anything like that. I didn't say that Jan couldn't have won the first round. Jan could have absolutely won the first round. You can absolutely give it to him. Like I was saying before, it was an extremely close round. It was very hard to score. So I don't think there is necessarily a wrong victor of that first round. I think you could give it to Magomed. I think you could give it to Jan Blachowicz. It was no way a robbery any which way the fight went unless you give the whole fight to Jan. right? Given the whole fight to Jan is pretty crazy, considering the fact that he absolutely lost that 5th round by a 10-8. This whole thing actually brought up a big issue that I was thinking about before. How subjective is cumulative damage? It's the most subjective thing on the whole criteria, because you have to kind of guess which strike is causing which kind of damage, you know? I raised this question before, how much cumulative damage has to take place for it to trump over immediate? It's so incredibly subjective, it's so incredibly like up in the air. I wish they defined it more. This is why scoring the Jan and Magomed fight was so difficult, because the majority of it was about cumulative damage. But cumulative damage is the most subjective thing on the whole list. And it got so many people debating about it, whether this kick was damaging or not, that kick was damaging or not. But we absolutely have to look at it as the cumulative damage has to happen inside of a round, not over a course of a fight. So cumulative damage is not going to really take much of an effect on the judging. If you look at strikes landed from rounds 1 through 5, and now finally in the 5th round, the damage is starting to take place. Those strikes in the 1st round don't really matter as much. The criteria absolutely needs to be longer. It needs more definitions. It needs more clarity. It needs way more specification. You need to be very specific with this stuff because it could be interpreted in so many different kind of ways. And the mess that cumulative damage is in the criteria needs to absolutely be addressed. It's the worst defining thing on the whole criteria. And earlier today, I was watching more of Alex Pereira's fights. I rewatched the Adesanya fight, and it still boggles my mind of how powerful the guy is and just how good he is as a fighter. After that accomplishment, you can go and say he's one of the greatest combat sports athletes of all time. He was a 2-division Glory Kickboxing World Champion, and then came into MMA and defeated the longest reigning champion currently in the UFC, and it shows how special of a fighter that he is. But what I would say is certain is he has the greatest left hook in all of combat sports. He made it one of the most dangerous weapons in kickboxing, and then he made it one of the most dangerous weapons in MMA. 2 different sports able to make the same move effective in both sports, whereas there are differences, right? But he's still able to do that. And against anybody he fights, that is the weapon that they always need to watch out for. But the left hook is not all of Pereira, right? He has so many more weapons. So it's different than, like, for an example, Dan Henderson's H-bomb. When Dan Henderson was in his prime, even out of his prime when he was old, the H-bomb was always known to be like one of the most dangerous weapons in all of MMA for many, many years. He can knock out heavyweights with that shot. And the guy is the size of a regular middleweight, maybe even a bigger welterweight. But the difference with Dan Henderson's H-bomb was you kind of knew when it was coming. And he always had the same kind of setups, and he was only using it one way. Moving forward, usually throwing a lead leg kick, and then lining you up with the right hand, either trying to get you to move into the punch like Michael Bisping did, or he's super aggressive forward, reaching with the punch. And it's usually not in close range. Pereira's left hook is much more versatile. He uses it in many different ways. For an example, like he'll move backwards and hit you with it, like he did against Thomas Powell, or sit in place and angle off a little bit like he did against Sean Strickland, or like he did against Bruno Silva, or he'll use it aggressively like he did against Adesanya, and he'll throw it long, he'll throw it short, he'll change up the angle just a little bit, and no matter which way he throws it, it's going to hurt you. There's no way to withstand that punch. And there has to be something about his body. There's something that makes his left hook much more powerful than any other punch. Because I've seen him hit people with big right hands and stuff, even in Adesanya with good right hands, but it never buckled him like when he got hit by the left hook. Even though that left hook, at the end of the fight, it didn't look as powerful as some of the other punches he got hit by. And this is seen throughout his entire combat sports career. His entire fighting career, there's something about his body mechanics that makes his left hook much more powerful, and I don't really know what it is. Notice even when he hits mitts, as soon as he lands that left hook, you can hear the thud, it's a lot louder. You can see the impact, it's different. I would really like to know if like they could get some scientists or doctors or whatever to examine Pereira on why his left hook is so much more powerful. What is there about his body that's making it different? Because usually your backhand is supposed to be more powerful. And I understand like he's catching these guys unexpected and stuff, but it's much more than just that. There's a difference in power generating, and I'm very curious about the science of that. You can actually give it the same saying of Mirko Krokop when they used to say right leg hospital, left leg cemetery. It's like the same thing with Pereira's hands. Right hand hospital, left hand cemetery. And with that, let's go right to the questions. And we're going to start with Nick Beatty. What are your top 5 how is this guy still standing moments? Romero eating the head kick from Paulo Costa is a big one. Shane Carwin taking a head kick from Junior Dos Santos was insane. Still to this day, I don't even know how he took that shot. And he was tired. He was hurt by that point. I would have to say the biggest moment was Roy Nelson taking that right hook from Derek Lewis, flush to the face, and he just laughs it off. I thought I would never see somebody laugh after taking a Derek Lewis right hand. But Roy Nelson was that guy. Couldn't take the Mark Hunt uppercut, but he was able to take Derek Lewis's right hook. Max Holloway, with all the damage he took from Dustin Poirier and Alexander Volkanovski, I was very shocked for him to stand up the whole time and never get dropped even once. Fabio Maldonado versus Glover Teixeira back in the day, he was hurt over and over again, but I was surprised the guy never got finished. Glover Teixeira battered him for the entire fight. And of course, Drew Dober's career. I mean, everybody he fights that hits him, he just takes it, man. Besides Terrence McKinney got dropped. But everybody else, man, he eats all of their punches, all of their kicks, and walks through them like they were nothing. And he's getting hit clean by some big punchers, too, that have knockout wins. Francis Ngannou taking those right hands from Stipe in their first fight, and he was so tired, too, taking those punches. The reason why taking punches when you're tired is so much more impressive is because that's actually how most knockouts happen. Most knockouts in combat sports happen when the fighter is already exhausted, and they cannot withstand the punch. This is sometimes why you're able to see guys later down in the rounds, they're not able to take some weaker punches that they were taking in the beginning of the fight. They can't brace for impact, but there's so many moments of this happening. Diego Sanchez's career, you could go down that. You could look at Carlos Condit versus Tyron Woodley taking those right hands. Robbie Lawler got barraged by Rory McDonald in their second fight. Nate Diaz's career as well, you could look down there. So many amazing moments where fighters just show their sheer toughness. Then go to Diego Stork. Whose decline was worse, Dominick Reyes or Tony Ferguson? I would say Reyes because Tony was showing signs of slowing down in the Cerrone fight, and he had a bad knee injury. And even though Reyes lost to great fighters, losing to Ryan Spann is such a steep drop in competition. I wouldn't say it's that big of a drop. I think Ryan Spann's very talented. He has a lot of power. The only thing about him is that he makes mistakes in fights defensively, that he makes mistakes in fights, especially offensively, where he leaves himself open. But he's a big, strong guy, and he can put out anybody with one big punch. But yeah, I would absolutely say that Dominick Reyes, at least where we thought he was competitively, around John Jones' level, he definitely did not live up to those expectations at all. He's on a 4-fight loss streak. 3 of those are by devastating knockout. And these are kind of knockouts that can make a highlight reel for the year. I'll have to say that Tony had a bigger decline because of how far he made it. He was a champion. He beat great fighters, had excellent performances. He reached a lot of people's expectations of him, and he fell to where he can't even get a win anymore, and he even lost to an aging Nate Diaz, which is something that nobody thought a prime Tony Ferguson would lose to, you know? Dominick Reyes is kind of at rock bottom, getting knocked out all over the place, but he never really ascended as high as Tony did. That's why I have to say Tony, because of how far he made it and how low he crashed, I would say is a bigger decline than Dominick Reyes, where he had a lot of promise early on, but didn't live up to those expectations. He was a young fighter with not a lot of experience, and people held him with so high regard after that Jones fight, he didn't even come close to what the fans thought about him. And that's sad. Then we go to Mike Griffith. Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler or Conor McGregor versus Jorge Masvidal. Which of those two fights interests you the most? I like Conor versus Chandler for the fact that it would be a lot more explosive, it would be more entertaining, and it could seem kind of like a backhanded compliment, but Jorge is not as reckless as Chandler, right? So he's not going to make the fight as entertaining. Chandler versus Conor is guaranteed fireworks from beginning to finish. 2 fast starters, a lot of power, go for the knockout every single time, and to put a show on for the fans. Jorge will sometimes go into a fight where he just does enough to win. He's done that many times throughout his career. Chandler would never fight in that way, especially if he has a Conor fight up ahead. Chandler risks his chance of victory to put on a show for the fans. It shows like a lack of care for winning in his career, but he's always going to be beloved. He's always going to be a fan favorite. He's always going to get money for his fights because of how he performs. He's always going to be remembered. Even though I love the Jorge fight though. I love that fight too. You can't go wrong with either, but the Chandler fight interests me more. The only thing is if Chandler starts wrestling, that just like throws a wrench into all of it. I have a feeling Chandler wouldn't do it. I have a feeling Chandler would strike with him up until he gets hurt, and then he'll start to wrestle. I think Jorge would out-wrestle Conor too, so. Then with John Jordan. Does Alex defend the 185-pound title as many or more times than Izzy? What odds do you give Izzy in the rematch? No, I don't think so. Even if he could, like, even his skills allow him to do it. Let's say he has better takedown defense than Izzy, and the fact that he is bigger, he has more power, he'd be a lot harder to fight for these middleweights. He's 35, so I don't think he has enough time to reach Izzy's record, and he probably has maybe like 3 to 5 years in him. And champions, especially at middleweight, usually fight 1 to 2 times a year. The fact that we haven't even heard of when they're going to do Pereira versus Izzy already is a bad sign of how active he's going to be. And an older fighter is not going to fight as active as younger fighters, generally speaking. But even with that, I don't think his wrestling is up to par. I think guys like Brunson and Vettori and Whittaker, these guys can exploit his takedown defense, whereas Izzy's been building on his takedown defense for many years. Then we go to Clifford Wilson. Hey Weasel, what do you think of Islam, Alex Pereira, and Jiri Prochazka moving up a weight class eventually? How successful do you think they would be, and what adjustments would they have to make, given how gigantic they are for their current weight class? What do you think about making YouTube Shorts content? Yeah, these guys are pretty big for their weight classes. I think they could absolutely fight in the weight class above. Now, Islam at 170 would be an issue from a lot of guys there. I think his biggest hurdle would be Khamzat. If you want to look at the bare bones of it, Khamzat's a bigger, stronger version of Islam, if you want to look at it that way. Kamaru Usman would also give him a lot of problems, especially with the takedown defense. I don't think Islam's going to strike with him. You have Shavkat Rakhmonov, who's a monster there too. Colby would be interesting, but I do think Islam would beat him. But he would beat guys like Leon. I think he would beat Bilal Muhammad. Burns is tough. That's a tough fight. I'd probably lean to Islam, but man, that is not easy. I could see how people could go with Burns on that one. He beats Wonderboy in my opinion. Jeff Neal, Sean Brady, Vicente Luque, Jorge, like down the list. There's only like a handful of guys there that make the fight at least competitive, if not beat him outright. And what would he have to change? I mean, it's hard for a wrestler to go up a weight class and be successful. Wrestling generally has to do a lot more with size, whereas a smaller striker versus a bigger striker can probably win more times than a smaller wrestler versus a bigger wrestler. All you have to do is touch the button once with a good shot and you can end it, and you have the speed advantage, which is inherently one of the biggest advantages you can have in striking. Whereas in wrestling, there's a lot of emphasis on size and strength that no matter how good you are really on the ground sometimes, if the guy's so much bigger and stronger than you, he can negate a lot of your skill. Do I think that would be true with Islam? Not necessarily. I think Khamzat would definitely give him an issue on the ground. Even though Islam is a better grappler, I think Khamzat could out-grapple him, especially trying to take him to the ground, you know? Islam's been taken down by some guys, especially Thiago Moises. If Thiago Moises is taken to the ground, you think Khamzat can't? So Usman and Khamzat are definitely the biggest issues for him. I would say Shavkat and Burns are next. And there's not much he can really do here. I mean, his striking is so far behind a lot of these guys. He's an outstanding grappler, and that's why he would beat the majority of the welterweight division, but those bigger grapplers would be a brick wall to him. Alex Pereira going up to light heavyweight would probably not go too well. I think he has a good chance of beating Jiri Prochazka, given the fact that Prochazka never shoots takedowns, rarely ever, and he's definitely a much better striker. With the fact that Prochazka doesn't have great defense, you want good defense against Pereira. Let's just say that. He hits you once and you're not the same anymore. Prochazka's been banking on his toughness for a while now, but against a guy like that, I don't think it'll work out for him. And they're roughly around the same size, which is crazy. Glover smashes Pereira. They would never fight each other, but hypothetically, Teixeira takes him to the ground and bullies him. Magomed does the same thing. Blachowicz probably does the same thing, to be honest. People forget that Blachowicz actually has some decent takedowns. Not the best in the world, but I think enough to take Pereira to the ground. Rakic does the same kind of thing. Anthony Smith, it's interesting because he also doesn't shoot takedowns that much. His wrestling's not on that kind of level. I think Pereira, being the bigger fighter, probably being the stronger fighter as well, might be able to hold off some of those takedowns, and he absolutely demoralizes him, demolishes him on the feet. So he could beat Anthony Smith. I think he beats Jamal Hill as well. I think he can beat Krylov, but Krylov has the skills to dominate Pereira. But the thing is, Krylov's fight IQ is like the lowest out of all these guys. He might make some big mistake and get knocked out. Paul Craig loses. I think he dives to the leg the entire fight. Doesn't really get much off. Loses probably on the scorecards or gets finished with one big shot after like 2 rounds in of Pereira trying to find it. Volkan, I think, loses as well. I don't think his wrestling's strong enough. Ryan Spann, I think, loses as well. Johnny Walker gets knocked into another dimension. Dominick Reyes, I mean, poor guy. You don't want to put him up against Pereira. Jimmy Crute could beat him. Khalil Roundtree gets destroyed. The thing about Alex Pereira, like, what does he have to change? Is all about his wrestling. Nobody's going to strike with this guy, right? No one's going to beat him on the feet. And now Jiri Prochazka going up to heavyweight, I think he does well against a lot of guys. I think he loses to guys like Ngannou. I think him and Ciryl Gane would be very interesting. I think Gane would outshine him for the most part, but he would show some danger to Ciryl Gane, man. Stipe is an interesting one. I think his boxing fundamentals are so sound where he would make Jiri pay with a bunch of those overextended punches, and he has the wrestling to always offset Yuri's stand-up, so I think Stipe wins as well. Pavlovich is too much of a monster. I think he's just simply too much of a tank. Like, what does Jiri do to this guy? Pavlovich can get him to the ground. He's so much bigger and stronger. He trades with you and he wins. He has a longer reach. One punch and this fight's probably over. Blades is an interesting one due to Yuri's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu when he gets taken to the ground. On the stand-up, Curtis doesn't really have much for him in my opinion. He could land some good right hands, but overall I do think Jiri beats him in the stand-up and makes things interesting on the ground. But I do see Blades winning that fight. Tuivasa gets destroyed. Tom Aspinall, I think, would beat him. Derek Lewis, I think, loses. I think Volkov might win due to his technical striking. The Rosenstrike fight would be an interesting one. I think that one's pretty close. I do favor Jiri, though, ever so slightly. He destroys Tybura, destroys Chris Daukaus, beats Spivak, beats Romanov over 5 rounds, destroys Shamil, and destroys Ivanov. And what about YouTube Shorts content? I thought about it. I thought of things like that in TikTok, and I have a lot on my plate. It's really hard for me to do other stuff right now. We'll see. If someone wants to, help me out with that, I'm all ears, man. Then would Du Bois himself. Hey Weasel, if you were Israel Adesanya's coach for the next Pereira fight, how would you train him to ensure his path to victory? Would you possibly have him bulk up and work more on wrestling and takedowns? Or would you have him work more on his striking? My little sister also said if she were his coach, she would have him watch all of his previous fights on video and study those fights for weaknesses. Keep up the good work, man. Love you. Thank you so much for the question, man. Yeah, obviously you're going to want to watch the other fights, but the thing about Adesanya is he has more experience with fighting Pereira than anybody else. So at this point, he should understand what Pereira's about. Still watch more fights, still watch his other MMA fights, which I do think he's doing. I mean, he always reacts to Pereira's fights, so he sees them, but it's a tricky situation. How do you get ready for the next one? I think he absolutely should bulk up. The takedown he got hit by was just pure strength, man. He just ran him over. Adesanya's gonna have to get a little bit bigger, not too much to the point where he's not used to it and it's foreign to him, right? He starts gassing out in the fight all of a sudden, but just enough, you know? A lot of Pereira's success happened because he was able to push back Adesanya in the stand-up. And with Adesanya getting a little bit bigger, his shots are gonna get Pereira to respect it a little bit more, so he can jab Pereira away, he can throw shots and forcefully make Pereira back up a little bit to give Adesanya more space. Adesanya needs to use more footwork, not necessarily use the clinch as a means of defense. In my opinion, that was a big mistake, especially up against a much bigger fighter than you and a guy who wants to get in your face. Welcoming the clinch like that and Pereira exiting, disengaging, and getting in his face and throwing punches and stuff, that's a very dangerous territory to be in. And you're not going to overpower him in those kind of situations, especially in the rematch now, because I think Adesanya was banking on him having more experience in the clinch in an MMA fight, where he uses the control to turn Pereira up against the fence, and he was doing that sometimes. But in the rematch, Pereira's going to be ready for that. So if Adesanya is cornered again, getting pushed back too easily, yes, I do think clinching is a last resort. He's going to have to do it to not get punched in the face, but it shouldn't be a game plan like it seemed it was. Another big issue as to why this clinching game plan was so bad for him was because he was extending his hands forward to clinch up at times, and Pereira would catch him over his arms. There's no defense there from punches. The defense only comes when you tie him up, but when you're reaching forward, you're defenseless. And Adesanya took some unnecessary punches when he was doing that. So that's why it should be more of like a last resort rather than something he's looking forward to doing. He's going to have to use his footwork and speed as his advantage in this one and putting out more activity, especially with the jabs and stuff. He rarely used any jabs in the fight. I mean, most of his success came off of his right hand. That is always going to be there. It seems like a chink in Pereira's armor when he fights Adesanya. It's just hard for him to get away from a right straight. So that's always going to be there, and Adesanya's jab is always going to dictate of how he's going to land it and when he's going to land it. Another thing is, Pereira oftentimes keeps his stance square to you, so it leaves more opportunities for you to throw push kicks to his body, side kicks to his body, and ultimately just more punches to the body. I mean, it's there for you to hit. And he stands up very tall, so his body's not necessarily leaning away from you. Look at Adesanya's stance in comparison to Pereira's. Adesanya's bladed sideways, and he's like in an idle lean. Whereas Pereira, his whole body is flat in front of you, which leaves a lot of opportunity for you to hit him to the body. And if he can go to the body, they can condition things up to the head and stuff, or even to the legs. This is also a great game plan for him to start to gas Pereira out in the fight, the bigger man, you know? So there are some things that Adesanya can do. In terms of going for the wrestling, remember, the only times Adesanya took down Pereira was because Pereira made a mistake. It wasn't because Adesanya was necessarily that much of a better wrestler. It's because Pereira overstepped a trip or something. Things that Pereira should not be doing at all. And I think he's going to learn from Glover going into this rematch to not do stuff like that. So I think the takedowns should be there just to mix it up, but it shouldn't be like a priority, you know? It shouldn't be like a game plan of his to focus on the takedowns. And then we go to Dangerously Dubious Double Davison. Hey Weasel, love your content. I have an idea. How do you feel Prime Olives does against these names in their prime? Whatever you think their prime is. Number 1, Islam Makhachev. I'm going to go with Islam, but I think it could be a competitive fight depending on how Oliveira shows up. Islam always has high fight IQ. He's never going to make mistakes like that. Oliveira sometimes will. He'll put his body into the fire, and maybe sometimes he shouldn't need to do that. But I do ride with Islam. Number 2, I think and always thought Khabib would smash Oliveira. It's a much worse style for Oliveira to fight up against. Number 3, Conor. Due to no boxing defense, Conor has a chance here, but I would ultimately go with Oliveira due to his wrestling, his kicks, even his own punches will disrupt Conor's. So I think Oliveira has more of a chance of winning here. Number 4, Eddie Alvarez. Definitely going to Oliveira. Number 5, Java dos Anjos. I'm going to go with Oliveira, but this is a tough one. With how well-rounded RDA is and how skilled he was and everything, boxing was fantastic. Kicks were on point and powerful. Wrestling was there. I don't even want to take him to the ground, but I think even still, Oliveira would give RDA so many problems on the feet. It would be somewhat similar to what Tony did to him on the feet, but more relying on fundamentals. Number 6, Anthony Pettis. Oliveira destroys Pettis. Number 7, Benson Henderson. I'm going to go with Oliveira, but that's a competitive fight. Benson is so defensively sound, and he's so well-rounded, he's going to be hard to take to the ground. But I can see Oliveira edging him on the feet because of the damaging shots, and even at some point getting the fight to the ground, whether it be pulling guard or taking Benson down. Number 8, Frankie gets destroyed. Number 9, BJ Penn gets obliterated. This would be the biggest mismatch of all time. And then we go to the public questions, and we're going to start with Mr. E. How do you see Sergei Pavlovich doing against the top dogs at heavyweight? Surreal, Francis, Stipe, Aspinall, and also John Jones. He's all the rage at heavyweight right now. And honestly, I don't think there is a bad fight for him. It's crazy because Sergei has such a bad first impression on us. For his UFC debut, he did get Alistair Overeem, which was not fair, but it was an older Alistair Overeem, and he got dominated, taken down, ground and pounded, and finished. It's crazy to see where he is now. He has not lost a fight since, and has been looking dominant. But how does he fight Ciryl Gane? I think he's a tough fight for Ciryl Gane, not only because he has power. Everybody Ciryl fights has power, like Ngannou and Derek Lewis and Tai Tuivasa. He's fought all the big hitters. So Sergei definitely has the puncher's chance, just like Tai Tuivasa did. But the thing is, we don't know where Sergei's wrestling's at. He hasn't gotten a single takedown in the UFC. He does have a lot of experience in Greco-Roman and combat sambo, but he's never using it. Even outside the UFC, he barely uses any wrestling. He strikes for the most part, and I don't think he's going to outstrike Ciryl Gane for 5 rounds. Now, there is some question people have as to whether he has good cardio. Yes, he actually has good cardio, which is crazy. Look at his fight when he fought Mikhail Mokhnakhin, where it went 5 rounds. And he looked good for 5 rounds. It was crazy throwing power punches. Rather a slow-paced fight, but then again, most heavyweight fights are slow-paced. But he lasted a good 5 rounds, man. So I definitely think 5 years later, he's going to have even better cardio than he had then. So I do think he could catch Ciryl Gane at any moment. But Ciryl will most likely beat him on the feet. The wrestling is going to be the biggest difference in the fight. How's he fight Francis Ngannou? I think Ngannou wins, but if there is someone who can really hurt him, it would be Pavlovich. But the thing is, I think Ngannou just hits so much harder. He's bigger and stronger as well. I would have to go with Francis. Stipe now. I think Pavlovich beats Stipe. I think the power is just too much. Stipe oftentimes drops his hands inside exchanges. You saw that when he fought Francis the second time, and even Daniel Cormier. I think Pavlovich will be able to stop the takedowns. He's so fast in exchanges, he can match Stipe, who is a bit smaller. But one shot from Pavlovich and that fight changes. Aspinall now. I'm going to have to go with Pavlovich. I think Aspinall keeps his chin too high. He blitzes down the center. He's going to eat a right hand to the jaw. And Aspinall's a very big guy. He might be able to take the fight to the ground. And if he does, Pavlovich would be in some trouble. But I do trust Pavlovich's takedown defense, backed behind the combat sambo experience. Now, Pavlovich versus John Jones is an interesting one, considering we still don't know how John Jones looks at heavyweight. They have the same reach. So anywhere Jones punches, Pavlovich is right there to hit him, and that automatically takes away one of Jones's biggest advantages and skills, and that is using his reach as defense. Can Jones take the fight to the ground? They're both Greco-Roman. Pavlovich is bigger though, and I'm pretty sure he's stronger than Jones. And if they ever get into those clinches, Jones is there to get knocked out at any moment. The biggest thing going for Jones, in my opinion, are his kicks, leg kicks especially, and try to wear down the bigger man. But ultimately, I go back and forth in this one. I would side with Jones in a 5-round fight. I think his IQ would definitely show here. And then we go to Blake Oakton. Hey Weasel, was always curious. Do you still get nervous for fights? I'm always so anxious for certain fighters. For an example, Robert Whittaker, Charles Oliveira. I think it's the air of vulnerability they seem to have. Appreciate all the work you do. Keep it up. Thank you so much, man. Yeah, I still get nervous for fights. After all these years, I thought it would eventually go away. Most of the time, I'm not nervous at all. But there are times where I am. Like Oliveira's fights get me nervous because of how reckless he can be sometimes. Chandler's fights get me nervous. Ngannou fights get me nervous. Jiri Prochazka fights give me sheer anxiety. This guy throws his body into the fire. He's like a bigger version of Tony Ferguson. I'm loving every second of it. And as for Whittaker, he's so technical. But man, when he gets hit clean. And it's always scary. So I know exactly what you mean by Whittaker. And he's a lovable guy, man. He's awesome. So nobody wants to see him lose. Like Wonder Boy as well. When Wonder Boy gets hit, it's clean sometimes. He doesn't get hit too often. But when it does, they get him pretty good, you know. And guys like him and Whittaker are fighters that we just don't want to see lose ever. And then with the Roman P. Hey Weasel, love the content. I have a couple questions. Now that Alex Pereira has dethroned Izzy, can you create a list of nightmare matchups for him or run through how does he do against the top 15 middleweights and Khamzat Chimaev? Also, how do you think Islam does against the top 15 welterweights, a matchup against Michael Chandler, and a rematch with Charles Oliveira? Thank you so much. Keep up the awesome content. Okay, this is a fun question. So, Pereira going up against the top 15 middleweights. I think you can imagine how it looks. I think he beats Adesanya in the rematch. I think he actually makes it look easier this time than he did last time. He loses to Whittaker. I think Whittaker is one of his biggest nightmare matchups considering how safe he is from a distance and his wrestling. Right? His wrestling is going to be such a big advantage going into the Pereira fight that Pereira's going to have to respect it so much that it'll leave him open to strikes. So Whittaker will have that like Khabib effect on Pereira. Jared Cannonier, I think, gets knocked out. I think whatever he does, Pereira just does better. Vettori might be the nightmare matchup because of how relentless he is with his takedowns. So he's very different than guys like Brunson and Whittaker, where they shoot and they kind of disengage, right? Or they clinch up with you and try to land big punches. Vettori will keep shooting on you. He will shoot, cling on to you, switch the grip, switch the angle of the takedown, and constantly make you work for it. And he's very strong, he's very big, does not gas out. And he has an iron chin. So if there's anybody who could take Pereira's punches, it would also be Vettori. This is why I would have to put him as the number one nightmare matchup for Alex Pereira outside of Khamzat. Derek Brunson is top 3 nightmare matchups as well. So it's Vettori, then I would say Whittaker, and then Brunson. So Brunson, he's the strongest pure wrestler there, but he's the weakest in the stand-up. And one punch and he's out. Pereira hits him once as Brunson has his chin up in the sky, hands forward, throwing punches. He's going to eat a left hook. But I could see him definitely beating Pereira using his wrestling as well. I think Paulo Costa would lose, does nothing to Pereira when it comes to the stand-up. I wouldn't be surprised though if Costa gets the fight to the ground though. But I don't think he would win 5 rounds doing that. I think eventually Costa would get tired and get knocked out. Strickland, I mean, how much better does he do, you know? I think he gets knocked out yet again in the first or second round. Roman Dolidze is an interesting one now. So this is a fun fighter that came out of nowhere. If he gets the fight to the ground, Pereira's finished. But he does nothing on the feet against Pereira. And can he get the fight to the ground? He doesn't have the greatest wrestling, but he only needs to get the fight to the ground once. That one could go either way. I'm going to lean to Pereira there, but it's tough. I can see how Dolidze submits him. Jack Hermanson, far better wrestler and grappler. He can get the fight to the ground. He has great jiu-jitsu, but he's so small, man. Would he get overpowered as soon as he creates contact? This one, I'm going to lean Hermanson, given his wrestling advantage here. And his wrestling is definitely better than Dolidze, so yeah, I'm going to go with Hermanson. Dricus du Plessis gets knocked out. He could be a bit too reckless. His wrestling isn't all that. I think he gets overpowered. Andre Muniz now. I think Muniz would win. I think he gets the fight to the ground just one time and submits him immediately. Nasruddin Imavov, I think, gets knocked out. A lot of people are probably thinking that he's some great wrestler because his last name is Imavov. That's not necessarily true. I think Kelvin Gastelum wins. I think he's just too tough and too good of a wrestler. Chris Curtis gets knocked out. Darren Till gets... I feel bad even thinking about that fight. And then Khamzat Chimaev, I think, might be the number one nightmare matchup if you bring him into the middleweight division. He's just by far the best wrestler and grappler there is. He's so fast. Even for welterweights, he's fast. He's a big guy as well. He's bigger than Hermanson. And his wrestling style is so relentless. I don't think Pereira will ever catch a breath. So I think nightmare matchups are Khamzat's number 1, Vettori's number 2, Whittaker's number 3, Brunson's number 4, and then either Muniz or Gastelum are number 5. Then we go to AFCA Dan. What do you think of the 10-7 round between Helwani and Paddy? It doesn't surprise me. A lot of people have already exposed Paddy's past when it comes to some things he said, especially against some Muslim fighters and other ethnicities and stuff like that. So it doesn't surprise me that he's lying to Ariel and making some stuff up here and there. It's a typical Ariel 10-7. He just handed one to Dylan Dennis too, so... But I don't know why Paddy would do this. I don't know why he would go after Ariel like that. Like, he's saying he's making money off the fighters. Like, he makes it seem like it's such a bad thing. Like, fighters don't go on a show willfully for exposure and, you know, because they like him, because they want a larger audience and stuff like that. A lot of fighters benefit from his show. For an example, a lot of people's first introduction to Paddy Pimblett was because of Ariel. And that's the honest truth. That was the truth with me. I don't know who Paddy was before he came on the MMA Hour. Even Conor was discovered by a lot of people because he was on the MMA Hour very early. Many fighters, and that's why he still has a good relationship with those guys today. I don't know anything about Ariel's personal stuff that he has with managers like Ali Abdelaziz and Habib, and I don't know his whole thing with these guys, but just the Paddy situation, it seems pretty strange, and a lot of people tagged me in that video showing me what was going on between them two, and it just doesn't surprise me at all. He left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths when he was going after Muhammad Mokaev and the things that he said about him. That was crazy that he said that publicly. And then what he was saying to Ilia Topuria. And then with the Dev, would you rather have Mark Hunt's uppercut or Roy Nelson's overhand? Y'all know Sauce says, me personally, Ben Askren spinning back fist. The most dangerous strike in MMA. I would rather have Mark Hunt's uppercut. I think having a good uppercut is just way cooler, and they can sneak into like tight spaces, whereas overhands are just looping and obvious, and you see it coming from a mile away. Uppercuts are sneaky, you know? Then we go to user KO3YB4TWNI. If Colby and Khamzat end up fighting, with the way that Colby is, do you see him bringing up Khamzat's relationship with Kadyrov? It's something I could genuinely see happening, and things could spiral out of control for both of them. Yeah, leave it to Colby. He would definitely bring that up. Me personally, I don't know anything about Kadyrov or anything going on over there. I just see some bits here and there about him being like a bad guy and stuff. I really don't know much about him, but it seems like bringing him up would be somewhat dangerous, I guess. And he's really tied in with a lot of fighters. I wonder why. I think he has his own organization, or at least he had his own organization, or at least he had his own MMA organization. And I saw that he was upset that Ankalaev didn't get the decision. So I don't know, man. It seemed like he was throwing out threats too. But 100% Colby is going to mention it. 1000% if him and Khamzat fight each other. What would be Khamzat's response, you know? What would he do? Does he have to just throw hands there to back that guy up? Like, what would he have to do? What would Kadyrov expect from Khamzat, you know? That would be so messy. But it would be hilarious, or at least extremely entertaining. What do you guys think? You think Colby will get a lot more fans for it? For people that know about that whole situation? Then what a carnage. How do you think Jan would do if he were to move down to 125? Also, can you do a breakdown of Ngannou versus Jones? Jan can't make that weight class. He's a perfectly sized bantamweight. He'd be way too big for 125 and way too small for 145. But if, like, hypothetically you bring his skills down to 125, he beats pretty much everybody. I don't think anybody really beats him. Moreno might give him some issues, and Davison, of course, is always going to give everybody issues. But yeah, I think Jan, hypothetically, if he was a smaller man with those skills, he'd be champion down there. And breakdown of Ngannou versus Jones. I've done this many times. I think it's been 3 years since the first time to talk about Ngannou versus Jones. And it's insane with the many times they've been rumored to fight. It hasn't happened yet. But I stick to what I always said. Nothing has changed. In fact, my confidence in Ngannou even grew over the years. Ever since the very beginning, years ago, I was like the only guy saying that Ngannou would beat Jon Jones. And now I'm fairly certain he would do it. He is the nightmare matchup for Jon Jones, in my opinion. You know, with the reach, with the size, with a one-punch knockout power. Jones has a good chin, but he's not taking Ngannou's punches. No one's going to take Ngannou's punches. I think if he fights intelligently and patient, he should stop the takedowns. Most of Jones' takedowns come from the clinch. Good luck clinching up with Ngannou and having success there. I think Jones' boxing defense is way behind the times now. And imagine if Dominick Reyes is getting past that reach and clocking him, defending takedowns and standing up whenever he got taken to the ground very quickly. What do you think Ngannou's going to do? Imagine that times 2 with Ngannou. And then with David Wynn. Hey Weasel, do you think Alex's takedown defense has been underestimated by the MMA community and fighters? Izzy only really took him down because Alex was off balance trying to go for a trip. Yeah, exactly. Other than that, he was 1-4 on takedowns. With a full camp preparing for a fighter like Whittaker or Vettori, would he be able to be as effective at stuffing takedowns as Izzy, since he is bigger in height, weight, and is under guidance of Glover? Thanks for the great videos every weekend. No problem, man. Great question. That is 100% the reason. Izzy isn't the better wrestler like that. I see a lot of people going around saying, like, Izzy should be the superior wrestler. He just had to do it more in the fight and he would have won. The time he took Alex down was because Alex got off balance himself. It wasn't because Izzy got him off balance. It's because Alex got himself off balance, going for a high-risk trip that he should never be doing against anybody. So yes, a full camp preparing for Whittaker and Vettori, it would definitely strengthen his takedown defense, but remember, you get better outside of training camp. So he should be preparing for this kind of stuff regardless, like preparing for a Vettori type of takedown or a Whittaker type of takedown outside of training camp. Because training camp is specific for an individual fighter, you know? And there's a lot of weight cutting involved, especially with a guy that big. There's going to be a lot of time on his diet and weight and all of that. But here's the only thing I think you're overlooking. The biggest issue with Pereira is not necessarily his takedown defense itself. It's his ability to stand up when he gets to the ground. Because his takedown defense was better than his ability to get up from the bottom when he got taken down. Izzy was able to hold him down for a bit. Take him down was tough for him, but holding him down was much easier to do. And that just shows a lack of skill when the size and the strength is taken away, when now he has to rely on his skill and techniques to stand up from the bottom instead of his strength and size to defend takedowns when he's on his feet. You see that big gap in Pereira's abilities. So that needs to be addressed, in my opinion, far more than just his takedown defense alone. But yes, full camp, preparing for Whittaker, or even outside of camp, his takedown defense is definitely going to get much better, to the point where I think he could stuff every single takedown from Izzy in the next fight. And Glover seems to be a very straightforward coach. He's going to tell Pereira exactly how it is and guide him to get enough takedown defense to the point where he will stuff all of Izzy's takedowns in the rematch. And then with the Water Legend, congrats on having Wonderboy take notes from your analysis. I am still in shock to this day. The only other time I was kind of like, I'm going to be honest, almost fanboying, was when Firas Zahabi gave me praise, because Firas Zahabi, I mean, I've always known him as one of the best coaches in MMA and one of the best minds. And usually coaches that give you praise, in my opinion, is better than a fighter. It's held in a higher regard than a fighter giving you praise, because they're the brains, right? They're the guys who analyze. Most fighters cannot really explain to you what's going on. You know, they have a harder time of explaining it, but they have a much better time of showing you. With coaches, they're the masterminds behind the fighters. They're the brains of the body. But with Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, I mean, I've learned so much from this guy just by watching him over so many years. I've been very high on him ever since he came into the UFC and had that beautiful knockout against Dan Stidgen. It's just so surreal that one day he just took notice of my breakdown, and I honestly never think about it. Whenever I make content, I never think a fighter is watching. I never think that. I think it's just us. That's how I imagine all this. But then to get fighters to actually pitch in, it always blows me back, man. So I greatly appreciate Wonderboy, man. But to your question, do you think Wonderboy should move up to middleweight properly? Since there are more strikers at middleweight that Wonderboy can have fun fights with, like Strickland, Izzy, Cannonier, Kelvin, and Till. Love your content. Cheers from England. Yeah, it probably wouldn't be a horrible idea. But the thing is, Wonderboy, he said so himself, he is not that big, right? Even for welterweight, there's guys there that are bigger than he is. I could only imagine he walks around like 190. So for him to cut down like 5 pounds to middleweight, there are guys he would beat there. I think he beats Sean Strickland. I think if Kelvin doesn't try to take the fight to the ground, he beats Kelvin. I think he beats Till in a rematch. Cannonier is tough. Like, if we're going to be honest here, that kind of power and size is not easy to get around. I think Wonderboy can do something there, but man, Izzy's a tough fight, right? Izzy's always going to be very tough. I wouldn't say go up to middleweight permanently, but there are fights there that he could take, because Wonderboy seems at a point in his career where there are fights for him to have and the fans would be so excited for. A Jorge rematch would be excellent. He wants to fight Nick Diaz. There's a lot of fun fights for Wonderboy. Then with a Mammal. Hey Weasel, love the channel. Started following the sport 2 years ago, and you helped educate me on it fast. I try my best, man. That's the mission. That's ultimately what I'm trying to do here. Just create a community where we can all enjoy the fights and look at fights a bit differently. Anyways, Tio Lopez just went on MMA Hour stating that he's more of a fan of MMA than his own sport of boxing. Do you think MMA has overtaken boxing in popularity yet? Most people still insist boxing is more popular, but I've seen quite the opposite. Thanks. MMA is UFC and all the organizations. We know one championship is massive in Asia. We know KSW is big in Europe. Bellator is doing good. UFC is obviously the biggest in the world. So I would have to say that generally, MMA is bigger than boxing. Boxing may have the most famous fighters at the top, like Tyson Fury and Canelo. But the fact that Conor is still fighting, Conor is the biggest combat sports athlete in the world right now. MMA has him. There is Israel Adesanya. Oliveira pulls in numbers. Francis Ngannou pulls in some numbers. Most of the champions are pulling in pretty good numbers, and the viewership are pretty good too. You also look at social media following and stuff. This seems to be true across boxing in all aspects. They are the most in each category when you're looking at like 2 or 3 fighters. But for the overall sport, they are lacking. This goes with pay and viewership. Like, for example, there's Julian Williams. A lot of people probably don't even know. Julian Williams was the light middleweight champion. He had the WBA, IBF, and IBO light middleweight titles from 2019 to 2020. He has 72,000 Instagram followers. There is no champion in the last 3 years in the UFC that has that low of followers. Not one. You can even look at, like, who's the least known champion. Let's look at Aljamain Sterling for an example. He has 532,000. That's much more than I thought. Can we even think of a champion in the UFC that has a lower follower count than Julian Williams? And this is not a knock on Williams. This is just to show the popularity difference between MMA fighters and boxers. Even contenders in the UFC, ranked fighters, have more exposure, more of a following, are more famous than champions in boxing. I was going to go to some of the female champions, but they're going to get a higher follower count for different reasons. Brandon Moreno has a big country behind him. Davidson Figueiredo has a big country behind him. What's an American contender that's never been a champion? Jamal Hill. Jamal Hill is 150,000. What's another boxing champion? And we could look at even pay-per-view numbers. So, for an example, the Charlo brothers, both champions, headlined a pay-per-view and it topped at 100,000. This is back in 2020. Topped out at 120,000 buys. Who in the UFC is getting under those pay-per-view buys? Maybe a bad Amanda Nunes fight? Like, who is getting that low of numbers? Even Fury versus Wilder 3 drew around 600,000 buys. 300,000 buys overseas, which is a bit different because the United States charges much more than other countries. That isn't even as much as Adesanya. Adesanya versus Costa drew in more than that. Fury versus Wilder 2 was bigger, where they drew around 850,000 buys, which was very successful. The guy drawing the most in boxing is Canelo, where he drew in 800,000 against Caleb Plant. The third Triple G fight drew in 1.06 worldwide, though, not just the United States. That's worldwide. Because remember, the United States pay-per-view buys are different. They're much more expensive. And they're also included in the DAZN subscription. So not just pay-per-view, but also the DAZN subscription. So it could be a bit misconstrued. But you see where I'm getting at. Like, overall, the sport of MMA, I believe, is more popular than boxing. Even if you go on social media, like you look up MMA content, it's much bigger than boxing content these days. And honestly, who do you have to blame for this? When you have Jake Paul, Logan Paul, KSI as like some of your biggest stars in boxing, who is there to blame for that? It honestly seems like the sport is slowly dying. If it continues this path, I see the sport of boxing being entirely about celebrity fights, YouTuber fights, instead of actual competition between professionals. One day, if it just continues down this road, I could see that absolutely happening. And then last question, we're going to go to the Takasi guy. A few podcasts back, somebody asked you to rate a champion's chances of beating the champion one weight class above. With all the title changes we've seen this year, I would like to ask the same question. Also, what do you think of these matchups? Masvidal versus Holland, Ferguson or Hooker versus Paddy, Colby versus Bilal, Oliveira versus Dariush. Love your content, keep it up. Thanks so much, man. Okay, I'm gonna go down the list here. So, Jiri versus Francis, I would give him like a 20% chance. Alex Oliveira versus Jiri, I would actually give him a 60% chance. Leon versus Pereira, I would give him like a 30% chance. I know he has some takedowns, but the man is too big. Even if he gets him down momentarily, I doubt he can hold him. Islam versus Leon, I would actually give him a 60% chance. Volkanovski versus Islam, I'll give him like a 35-40% chance, somewhere around there. Aljamain versus Volkanovski, I'll give him like a 25% chance. And Figueiredo versus Sterling, I'll give him like a 35% chance. And also Shevchenko versus Nunes, I'll give her a 55% chance. And Zhang Weili versus Valentina, I'll give her like a 35% chance. Now, Masvidal versus Holland. Okay, so this fight is not that one-sided. Masvidal's biggest chance of winning this is going to the ground, right? Using his wrestling, using his vastly superior Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu skills, land ground and pound shots, soften him up and try to get a submission. It's an approach that Masvidal doesn't usually go into fights with. Because here's the thing, if he tries to stand up with Holland, yes, I do think he's the better striker. Yes, he'll tag Holland more times than Holland will tag him, but one big shot from Holland, this fight could be over. Holland's also extremely durable, as you saw in the Wonderboy fight, and he can last pretty long. So even if Holland doesn't find the shot right away, if Masvidal keeps standing with him and doesn't take the fight to the ground or mixing it up, I see him eventually getting caught. So being intelligent, Masvidal would win. Not being intelligent and standing the whole fight, I could see him getting knocked out late. Ferguson or Hooker beat Paddy. Even right now, they're better strikers. They're not going to get taken to the ground. They're very tough. They're much more experienced. It's a bad fight for Paddy with either of them. Now, Colby versus Bilal. I think Colby pretty much does what he wants with him. Not only is Colby a far better wrestler, he's going to be able to out-scramble Bilal at any opportunity, but he's also a more technical striker. Not as much power, but understands striking better than Bilal does. He's more athletic. He has a better gas tank, higher output. It's a tough fight for Bilal Muhammad, where Colby pretty much does what he can, but better. And then Oliveira versus Dariush. This is a tough one, but I would have to go with Oliveira. He would really need to pay attention to that left overhand from Dariush. If he's able to get around that, he should be able to win this. If it goes to the ground, Oliveira absolutely destroys Dariush in my opinion. And even on the feet, Dariush sometimes drops his hands, he sometimes leaves himself open down the center, and a lot of strikes from Oliveira comes on that line, so I would have to go with Oliveira on this one. And that's the end of the podcast, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure to give this a thumbs up. If you enjoyed my content, make sure to subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Next podcast will be next week.